Good morning, afternoon or evening, depending on where this finds you, and welcome to this UNIDIR event. I'm James Revel, I'm the Programme Lead with the WMD and other Strategic Weapons Programme at UNIDIR. And this event is going to focus on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This treaty entered into force last week on the 22nd of January, and as the UN Secretary General indicated in his remarks, the treaty represents an important step towards the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. And in view to better understanding this treaty and looking at its implementation in particular, UNIDIR has set up a series of events late last year with a view to better understanding some of the issues faced in terms of implementation. The issue of implementation is important, but it often receives less attention than the process of negotiating an international agreement. Moreover, historical experience with other treaties suggests that states parties sometimes underestimate what is required for effective implementation. Nonetheless, this remains important. So to better understand some of the challenges that may be faced, some of the opportunities, this series of short events has been designed to look at different aspects of the implementation of the TPNW. We will have future events. Next week, we'll look at compliance, verification and enforcement of the TPNW. And then in 2 weeks' time, we'll have a short event looking at the consolidation of the TPNW. Moreover, last week, UNIDIR organised a panel discussion looking at national implementation, victim assistance and environmental remediation. A video recording of that event is available from a link which my colleague Letitia will put in the chat in due course. But for this session, we want to look at institutional support for the TPNW. It will, of course, be up to TPNW states parties to determine the form and the functions of any institutional support mechanism. And in advance of that discussion, we thought it'd be useful to provide some food for thought around this issue. And today, to do that, we have two excellent speakers currently here, and we are hoping to be joined by a third speaker, internet connection permitted. First, if I could perhaps introduce Tamara Patton. Tamara is a doctoral student in Science, Technology and Environmental Policy at Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs. Prior to coming to Princeton, Tamara worked as a researcher at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. She is also the co-author of a scholarly article titled Fit for Purpose, an evolutionary strategy for the implementation and verification of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And this report outlines, amongst other things, one approach to developing institutional support for the TPNW. We're also joined by Chris King, who is Deputy Chief of the WMD branch of the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, UNODA. Prior to joining UNODA, Chris was first Secretary at the Australian High Commission in India, and he also serves as the Deputy Secretary General for the NPT Review Conference Secretariat. So we're delighted you can join us, Chris. We're also hoping to be joined by Sheila M. Nwebe, who is Director of the Conventional Cluster Munitions Implementation Support Unit. We've spoken to Sheila earlier today, and she's indicated that she's had some issues with her Zoom connection, but we're nonetheless hopeful she'll be able to join at some point. Prior to joining the ISU for the Convention on Cluster Munitions, Sheila worked as a Programme Manager for the Norwegian People's Aid Humanitarian Disarmament Programme in Zimbabwe. And she's also worked with the Zambia Ministry of Foreign Affairs, including as Deputy Permanent Representative of Zambia to the UN in New York. Thank you for the two of you for joining me so far. And as I say, we hope Sheila will be able to join us in due course. The format for today is a moderated conversation, followed by a series of more open participant question and answers. So to begin with, I will pose a series of questions to our panelists who will then provide responses. And after a couple of rounds of questions from me, I will open up the virtual floor to Q&A and invite participants from the audience to pose questions. I should also point out that all panelists are speaking in their personal capacity at this event. Moreover, we are quite constrained for time, so rather than take oral interventions and questions, I'd encourage you please to use the Q&A function to submit written questions. The Q&A button can be found at the bottom of the bar in the Zoom window. If you click that, please enter your question. Other participants in this event will not be able to see your questions, but we will try and get to as many as possible, although because of the time limits, we can't make any promises to do that. Also, please don't feel you have to wait for the Q&A session to begin to submit questions. Please feel free to do so at any point. Okay, So without further ado, I'll proceed to open up the moderated discussion. And perhaps if I can turn to you first, Tamara, to sort of set the scene. In your article, you talk about the establishment of an implementation support unit for the TPNW, amongst other things. So could you begin perhaps by elaborating on this idea and give us a sense of what you talk about in the article?
Sure. Thank you, Jamie, and thank you very much to UNIDIR for having me and for hosting this very helpful series. So I think in answering your question, it helps to start off by thinking in terms of what we're trying to accomplish when we talk about ideas for institutional support for the TPNW. I think it means figuring out how to best enable the treaty to work as part of the international system in coordination with other instruments to help advance nuclear disarmament goals and objectives. So as we know, civil society groups are already doing a great deal to make the treaty work for disarmament at the public level. But another big part of this question is how to also make it work at official government levels through the UN system. So an implementation support unit is one way, though certainly not the only way, to start this process. In the paper you mentioned, which I co-wrote with my colleagues Sebastian Philippe and Zia Mian, we discussed the idea of an evolutionary approach to institutionalizing the TPNW, keeping in mind some of the long-term goals and technical requirements of the treaty. And we do our best to reconcile this desire to infuse more coordination, precision, and technical rigor into nuclear disarmament work, while also considering financial and resource limitations involved. So we suggest beginning with considering something like an ISU to accomplish essentially 3 tasks. There could be more, but we start off by proposing these 3 initially. So the first task would be to collect, organize, and distribute information relevant to the implementation of the treaty. So things such as declarations, information to support national implementation and positive obligations, and information related to international cooperation and assistance. The second important task would be to help establish relations between the TPNW and existing instruments and organizations. So organizations like the IAEA, the CTBTO, and others. This would contribute to the diffusion of the treaty's principles by encouraging these organizations to discuss and decide on their relationships and possible contributions to the implementation of the TPNW. Similarly, the ISU would also be a focal point for engagement between the TPNW states parties and other states toward the goal of universalizing the treaty, which, as we know, is required effort under Article 12. And the third task, which I believe we'll talk a bit more about in depth later in this discussion, would be to coordinate a process of scientific and technical engagement and advice, including engagement with civil society, about some of the more complex implementation and verification elements of the treaty, including those related to the treaty's obligations on victim assistance and environmental remediation, as well as those relating to verification, including the set of standards that would be applied and the measures that would be taken if a nuclear weapon possessing state decides to join the treaty. So my colleagues and I had sought to begin this discussion by focusing on the idea of an ISU, given that this has been the format followed by most treaties without a large dedicated verification organization. So some ISUs, varying in size, have been hosted within the UN, others by independent organizations. But as we start to discuss different options, I think regardless of where it's hosted or how we officially term it, whether it's an ISU or a secretariat, I think what's important is to think about is how to structure a dedicated institutional capacity and this focal point for the TPNW to be able to do work on these 3 core tasks and others, which we think would represent some unique contributions to the disarmament work of the UN system. And in the last panel, there was discussion about creating a community of practice around nuclear disarmament and addressing the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. And I really agree with that idea. I think what we hope for, no matter which form institutional support takes, is to figure out how to best enable the treaty to work for disarmament at these multiple levels, and to do so in a way that, that draws on the unique ways that the treaty integrates and codifies these key technical and legal issues related to nuclear disarmament. So I think I'll pause there and hand it back to you, Jamie.
Thank you very much. There's certainly a lot of food for thought there, so thank you, Tamara. I might come back to a couple of points on that process, but if I could turn to you first, Chris, and I wonder whether you could shed some insights into the sort of financial or practical implications and challenges in setting up this ISU type model, particularly in the current climate. So I'll start with you, Chris.
Thanks, Jamie, and would like to also thank UNIDIR for this series of events, which I think is helpful, and also to Tamara and her colleagues for the great intellectual work that they've been doing on this issue to date. I think it's sparked a very good conversation, and it's been some very helpful work to date. I think you've stuck me with the role today of being the penny pinching bureaucrat, but I guess I'll embrace that and be quite frank about the conversation. As Tamara pointed out, there are pros and cons to every model, and there's really no such thing as a template for an ISU. You have some secretariats that are completely outside the UN, like the ATT. You have some where the ISUs have implementation functions outside the UN, but the secretariat functions for conferences and meetings are performed by the UN, such as the CCM or landmines. And then you have some where ISUs are staffed by the UN, such as the CCW or the BWC. As I said, there are pros and cons to every model. These largely relate to substantive political, financial, and human resource issues. I should stress too at the outset that I'm coming from a UN perspective. So some of the things that I think are cons might be pros for other stakeholders and vice versa. I think when you talk about the challenges facing ISUs in particular, it's really important to be frank and upfront that every single ISU connected to a disarmament treaty has suffered from financial problems. And in some cases, that has significantly impeded the implementation of the treaty in question, primarily because it leads to major staffing problems. Also on the issue of finances, depending on the models, there are some inconsistencies. Some are entirely funded by extra budgetary funds. Some are a combination of regular UN budget funds and extra budgetary funds. And this certainly leads to some confusion, particularly when it comes to different funding mechanisms and different bills for implementation and secretariat services to the states parties. I think one of the other challenges that we face with ISUs is the division of labor issue, that secretariat versus implementation issue. And if you take the CCM, for example, I think that you could say that there may be some cause of confusion and problems in terms of reporting lines for states parties and the staff of the ISU. Also on that division of labor issue, there's some cause of confusion in terms of reporting lines. On the one hand, ISUs report to member states, but they're accountable in performance to the UN. They're financed by member states, but they're substantially accountable to member states, but also in practice to UN bosses. UN bosses are accountable for performance of the ISU, but they're not really mandated to impinge on the substantive work of the ISU and its priorities. So there's some challenges there just in terms of the human resources and the lines of reporting. I think sometimes when you have these hybrid models too, say you have, again, outside the UN implementation, inside the UN Secretariat, you get different rules of operation. And so, the smooth operating of meetings often relies entirely on good interpersonal relationships between the UN and the ISU staff. Otherwise, there is actually history where these two bodies can work at cross purposes. From a human resources perspective, I think where ISU staff are UN staff, but extra budgetary funded, there are challenges related to HR rules. For example, rules about giving staff ongoing contracts under the UN system, but when the treaty is in financial difficulty and needs to reduce staff costs, there's a problem there about who has the mandate to do what when it comes to staffing. And then finally, I think one of the biggest challenges related to the way that ISUs have been formulated thus far is that it's basically given us a fragmented approach to support mechanisms, which in turn has led to a fragmented and siloed approach to disarmament, sort of impeding the holistic implementation of general and complete disarmament and the role of what the United Nations and its member states are trying to achieve. I think when we talk in the TPNW context now and what we're setting up, and again, I would say that the article by Tamara and colleagues has given us a very good basis for conversation. I think we have the opportunity to get it right. What this requires is some very deep strategic thinking and planning at the outset about exactly the model that's needed, and in particular, what kind of sustainable funding mechanisms will be required to ensure that the support mechanism is fully funded over the life of the mandate. And this is clear budget lines for staffing, who's paying, for example. We have situations where for the cost of meetings, you sometimes have observers paying as well. But is that the case for the ongoing work of the ISU? How will the budget be separated? These kind of issues really need to be thought out. They're mundane, but they're very important to the future life of the ISU and therefore to the life of the treaty. And I think as we start the process of moving towards the first meeting of states parties, this should be a dialogue among states parties. I think the one thing I'd add on the end here is that the TPNW, because of its relatively small membership, is not really in a financial position to consider some of the models of ISUs that have been mentioned yet. It may be in a position to do so as more states join the treaty and therefore improving the financial position, but I'm not sure it's there yet. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. There's again food for thought there as well. And it almost strikes me as being important to at least have some sort of idea of some of the costings of different models in advance of discussions moving forward. So in the same way as past BWP review conferences have had background papers on financial implications of future activities, that sort of thing seems quite useful for states parties to have in mind. Okay, I'll move on to some of the sort of second set of questions. In the meantime, I'd also encourage participants in the audience, if you've got questions you want to put to our speakers, please do feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function down at the bottom of the screen. But perhaps if I can turn to you, Tamara, in terms of the scientific and technical advisory process that you elaborate on. Could you talk about the role of this and how it would work and support TPNW implementation? And then I'll come back to you, Chris, for a little bit of insights into experience around the MPT side of things. Tamara, perhaps if you want to go first.
Sure, thanks. So as many listening to this will know, there's already been a lot of work. There are a lot of ideas and concepts and technologies out there about how to approach nuclear disarmament, both in terms of verification and in terms of meeting positive obligations. So what the TPNW states parties will need to do and to decide is how they will interpret and apply various proposals to meet the stated provisions of the treaty. So for example, one set of questions relates to standards that will be set for the irreversible elimination of a nuclear weapon program, as is called for in the text. So there are sort of two projects wrapped up in that. One is to articulate what is actually meant by a nuclear weapon program in terms of the wide array of facilities, laboratories, factories, and institutional support mechanisms that support nuclear arsenals. We currently don't have a definition for that or a standard for that. Another project is to articulate what standards will be set for irreversibility in terms of weapon and program elimination, where a number of, again, technical and institutional factors will have to be carefully considered. So these are just some examples. There are many others that could be put on the table. So the TPNW's work will, in some cases, involve further developing ideas, in some cases, coordinating and linking existing proposals, and in some cases, transforming ideas into, again, this set of standards that make clear to the world what the TPNW seeks to achieve, and which could, most importantly in practice, be helpful in encouraging and guiding the disarmament process. In our paper, we discussed that one way to facilitate this type of work and process would be through a scientific and technical advisory process, which the ISU or Secretariat would coordinate. And one option we point to, there are several options. One option we point to is a scientific and technical advisory board, which is a mechanism that's been used to build substance and legitimacy around treaty efforts in the past. Under this model, experts are nominated by states parties. They participate in their independent capacities from their home institutions, and they offer research and recommendations to the states parties through reporting and through the MSP. The benefit of this structure being that members have longer terms, they're more stable focal points for this kind of work, and are able to go in a bit more depth than some other possibilities. Another model worth serious consideration, which has been mentioned in the series already, is a working group or committee structure. And just to summarize, typically these groups are led by representatives from states parties, and their annual or every other year meetings invite international organizations, civil society organizations, and in some cases industry, to participate in discussion on matters of importance to implementation. This format, again, has the benefit of establishing focal points for various issues and can be a useful way to extend the capabilities of the ISU in terms of facilitating advice and reporting. In our paper, we offer some ideas for topics that working groups or committees might focus on. We list things like nuclear disarmament verification approaches and options, including scope and technical standards for irreversible nuclear weapon program elimination. Another being technical and legal issues related to victim assistance and environmental remediation. Another possible group being dedicated to approaches for universalization of the treaty. One last approach I'll mention, which could be considered as a complement to the other approaches I mentioned rather than an alternative, is an innovation conference. Treaty organizations in this sphere have used these conferences to bring public and research attention to issues of importance to the treaty. So for example, the IEA Safeguards Symposium, you can think of the CTBT Science and Technology Conference. These are important forums for engaging governments, organizations, and universities on these issues. TPNW states parties could consider possibly hosting an innovation conference in the future dedicated to the treaty's issues like nuclear disarmament verification, humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, and on approaches for victim assistance and environmental remediation. Right now, as Chris mentioned, a lot of this work is being conducted in the UN system, but in many cases, the reporting, it often sits in digital archives without a great deal of public attention or visibility. So I think it is worth thinking about how something like an innovation conference approach might help to this end in complementing the work of an ISU or secretariat and an advisory process. So just to wrap up, I think states can start thinking about these different options for ways to establish an advisory process, which on one hand, I think is really, it's a useful way to counter criticism that the treaty does not give due weight to inevitable technical issues like verification challenges, but more importantly to, again, as others have said, to develop a community of practice around the treaty and do so in a way that will effectively complement the choices that the states parties ultimately make in terms of institutional support. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tamara. And you touched upon one of the questions that's been raised by our audience. I'll come back to you on this, but this relates to verifying disarmament. I'll come back to that. First, if I could put the question to you, Chris, and you touched upon it already, but practically speaking, how do states parties go about setting up an institutional body? What steps need to be undertaken, for example, with the NPT Secretariat type body? What would they need to do to be able to move forward with this?
Thank you, Jamie. And I mean, again, I think Tamara's touched on some examples. I mean, the NPT is an interesting example, primarily because it's of the way it's evolved since the treaty entered into force, and it's very different now than it was in 1970. I think that very much reflects the evolution to the three pillars approach and the post 1995 so-called NPT 2.0. And I think that the NPT is an example that, to say upfront with these caveats, it benefits from, having near universal membership from a funding perspective. It significantly benefited from the fact that the IAEA was already in existence when the treaty came into force. So it had its technical body, the body that would undertake the technical issues, the inspections of safeguards and so on and so forth already existed at the time. It also benefits significantly from regular budget funding for staff, but extra budgetary funding for meetings and conferences. And I think it's really moved to, again, sort of post-95 and really sort of post-2005 into a task force model. And that task force obviously requires coordination and strategic planning because it has a lot of moving pieces, but it has some serious pros to it as well. And the first is that you have technical expertise provided by the IAEA, who are obviously world-leading experts in their field. You have UN regular funding that allows the task force to draw on, in this instance, ODA expert staff in areas such as civil society liaison, outreach, PR, all that kind of stuff. And obviously, it provides financial stability in terms of staff costs. I think those are three serious advantages that the NPT Secretariat has. In terms of stepping up the body, though, if you look at the way other treaties evolved, and I think, Tamara's point about scientific and technical advisory bodies, obviously the CTBT is the primary example there. And that body met for a long time before that treaty was even negotiated. But, you could flip the model. I think that you need to take a very strategic perspective when you're setting up an ISU, and that is to look at what the short-term, intermediate and long-term needs of that ISU are based on what the needs of the state's parties are. And how can a support mechanism be established to evolve and adapt to meet those needs? You need to plan for the administrative, logistical, substantive and technical support that unit's going to provide to states parties, and particularly the office bearers of the various conferences and meetings and so on. And I think, again, and I don't want to underline this so much, but I think, again, you really have to think and strategically plan about the funding concerns. But obviously, the first step is to think about in an ISU is what do you want? And that comes down to staffing, mandate, all of those particular issues need to have a lot of thought put into them.
Chris, I might follow up on a couple of those points subsequently by getting into the issue of the possible roles in terms of declarations and national implementation. But firstly, if I might go to a question from the audience, which is directed towards Tamara. And the question is, if it ever gets to the point of verifying disarmament, the TPNW authority would need cooperation of nuclear weapons states. This cooperation may not be offered. So how would the authority deal with this? I'll pass that over to you, Tamara. Good luck.
I'm so sorry, Jamie. Can you repeat the last part of the question? You broke up.
Yeah, sorry. The question was how would the authority deal with this? So the TPNW authority would need the cooperation of nuclear weapons states in order to contribute to verifying disarmament. This cooperation may not always be offered. So how would an authority go about dealing with that particular challenge?
Sure, thank you. Got it. So I think I'm happy to address this in brief, but I understand there will be another panel in this series devoted entirely to the issue of verification challenges and questions. And again, we go into depth in this in our paper about how some of these challenges might be addressed, both in terms of institutional approaches and technical approaches. So as a first measure, I'll invite you to attend that discussion for a more in-depth take on this. Just as an initial response, I think it's a common misperception, I think, that you need nuclear weapon states in order to verify disarmament. I think we have, there's been a lot of research and a lot of work on how you can use different strategies and technical approaches to manage nuclear weapon information in a way that it doesn't need to be exposed to non-nuclear weapon states if they are managing this process. And anything from things like template or attribute approaches for information barriers to mask weapons, to mask information from nuclear weapons as a part of inspections, to broader strategies for disarmament that really only focuses, for instance, on accounting for fissile material balances coming out of the program. So you might design your approach to only account for material as it is transformed into a form that is possible for inspectors to look at that doesn't have any classified attributes. And again, with approaches like nuclear archaeology, where you can sort of back out how much fissile material was produced within the lifetime of a nuclear weapon program, and at least to approximate it to a reasonable measure, you can focus on things like fissile material accounting instead of dealing with the actual weapons and dealing with classified attributes. So I think that's a first pass at that answer. But again, I think there's a lot more we can discuss in terms of how you would link the work of the ISU and the work of the scientific advisory process to building the institutional and the technical basis for facilitating that process in a way that complements what the IAEA can also do for that process. So yeah, I think I'll pause there. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thanks, and thanks for taking on that question. So perhaps if I could turn to you, Chris. So Tamara's sort of spoken about the role it could potentially play in verifying disarmament. But I suppose a question for you, Chris, the potential role that an institutional support body might play in, for example, supporting the completion of declarations or supporting national implementation activities. Could you elaborate a little bit on the potential role that could be played there, or indeed in terms of cooperation?
Thanks, Jamie. I mean, when it comes to declarations, obviously that process is already underway. If you go to the UNIDIR website, you can see that some of those direct declarations have actually been posted on the website already. You know, our current means of assisting with declarations are to circulate advice on how to prepare those declarations, as the treaty itself doesn't specify a template for those declarations. So we circulate the declarations, we publish the declarations, and we also publish very helpful models prepared by the ICRC, you know, for the assistance of states parties. Some states parties, in terms of the declarations, will be a little bit more complicated, e.g. South Africa and Kazakhstan. You know, they've previously either had a nuclear weapons program or had nuclear weapons on their territory. The model declarations, again, here are very helpful, but it's our responsibility to work with states and our Office of Legal Affairs to help with those draft declarations. I think in terms of national implementation, I mean, I think one of the key points behind the TPNW is that it's relatively straightforward. And, you know, given that many states parties are already members of nuclear weapon-free zones or, you know, the NPT or the CTBT. So, but again, we are available to help with the implementation of the national implementation of the treaty's requirements. That is something that states can reach out to us for help from whenever they like. And I would assume that would be a top priority for any support mechanism for the treaty going forward. I think, as Tamara rightly pointed out, when you get to the technical implementation and technical cooperation, you know, this is where you need a technical body. This is where you need your, you know, PTS for the CTBTO or the IAEA. You know, they can carry out such kind of technical cooperation. But what a support mechanism can do is be responsible for creating, at least initially, relationships with other intergovernmental organizations, you know, that can assist in terms of the technical provisions of the treaty, be it, you know, related to victim assistance or environmental remediation. And in that sense, they don't necessarily have to be from the disarmament world. If there are other, you know, intergovernmental bodies or other international organizations out there that have experience, for example, in environmental remediation, you know, it could be a support mechanism's role to create a relationship with that particular body for the benefit of states parties. And obviously, as Tamara has said, verification of disarmament would clearly require a technical body.
Thank you, Chris. If I could remind all participants in the audience, if there's any questions you'd like to put to our panelists, please do get in touch using the Q&A function down at the bottom of the screen. We have a couple that are starting to come in. So perhaps there's one which has already been touched upon, but I think it's probably worth reiterating. And this really relates to a participant indicating they would be interested in examples of institutional disarmament, examples or models that have been described that are broadly similar to other treaty secretaries or institutions. Or are there particular frameworks that we should consider, for example, the climate change area, which could be of interest to the disarmament community, particularly the TPNW community moving forward? There's one question there. Does anybody want to take that one? I mean, there's a couple have already been mentioned. Chris, please go ahead.
I mean, yeah, I do. I think that obviously in doing due diligence, you should probably do all background checks and look at all the multilateral bodies. But if you look, for example, at the UNFCCC, like the Secretariat for the Climate Change Model, I mean, it's huge. I'm not an expert in it, but it's my understanding that it's some 400 people. And it is a split between, technical experts and secretariat functions. It does have an analysis function for looking at climate change data supplied by states, parties, and participants. So it is a model that's worth looking at. But again, it is an evolutionary model. It's evolved very much over time, and it's huge compared to most of the disarmament bodies.
And Tamara, do you want to follow up with any examples? Please go ahead.
Sure. Just to mention another model that we suggest in the paper, it sort of it draws on some of the experience from organizations like UNMOVIC, the United Nations Monitoring, Verification, and Inspection Commission, which sort of we saw as a potentially useful model to learn from, in the sense that if a nuclear weapon state decided to join, and in the absence of another competent international authority stepping forward to help verify this process, TPNW states parties might need to act fairly rapidly in order to set up its own competent international authority to facilitate this process. UNMOVIC has models for how you would do things like establishing a special inspectorate and facilitating a roster of inspectors that you draw from various disciplines and areas of expertise that would be needed to accomplish objectives for the disarmament and verification process. And so, we talk about in the paper how the ISU or Secretariat, how the scientific and advisory process might start to think about laying the groundwork should that process need to happen in the future in terms of setting up a special inspectorate. And again, I think there's a lot we can learn from both positive and negative lessons of how this has been done in the past in order to make the process potentially more streamlined should this need to happen in the future.
Thank you, Tamara. I mean, just from my side as well, the Biological Weapons Convention Implementation Support Unit is a small organisation consisting of 3 persons, but it perhaps provides another example, and it's worth noting this links back to Tamara's point on the sort of evolutionary model that was only set up in 2006, if I recall correctly, from a decision of the 6th Review Conference. So it is possible that things can change. And also another potential example which deals with issues of assistance is the CCM, which we're hoping to have Sheila join us to talk on, but unfortunately that doesn't seem to be possible. Just coming on to some more of the audience questions there. There seems to be a comment in there, but there's also have a question here on the pros and cons of making these institutional decisions at this stage versus closer to when a nuclear weapon state or a nuclear allied state considers joining. I don't know whether anybody wants to take that question. So questions related to the designation of international competent authority. Do you want to? Is that something you want to do at this stage, or is it something you do closer to a wider to the joining of other states? Does anybody want to take on that question at all? Okay. Tamara, please.
is certainly an open question for debate and discussion, but I think at least my colleagues and I sort of came down on the side of, the earlier we can begin these processes and sort of fill in this institutional gap and knowledge gap, the better. I mean, if we look at the existing technical capabilities to address something like, a nuclear weapons state seeking to join the treaty and to for this process to be verified, the IAEA, for example, was not created to address disarmament as such, and certainly not in the way that is envisaged by the TPNW. As you know, its monitoring mission has primarily focused on civilian fissile material production, stocks, and use with a view to preventing diversion for weapons purposes. It has had some experience related to dealing with nuclear weapon programs, but this has only ever involved nascent or renounced programs. It has never had to deal with the types, the scale of nuclear weapon programs that we're talking about that exist for our standard group of nuclear weapon states that have very large, very embedded nuclear weapon programs that have a much wider variety of facilities and institutional structures involved, as well as much larger stocks and uncertainties in terms of fissile material accountancy. So I think there is both institutional and technical work that can be done to answer questions related to how disarmament verification would proceed should a weapon state decide to join the treaty. And again, I think the earlier we can start this process or this discussion, the better.
I'll hand that question over to you, Chris, but before I do, if I could remind participants, if you do have any questions to put to our panelists, you have the opportunity now, so I'd encourage you to do so if you want to. But Chris, did you want to, you spoke about strategic planning and the importance of really thinking this through, so I'd be interested in your thoughts on making decisions at this stage as well. Chris, please.
Thanks, Jamie. I mean, look, the thing that I would say at the outset is that these are decisions for states parties, and only states parties can take this decision. So I want to make that very clear from my perspective on the Secretariat. But I would say that I both, agree to a certain extent and disagree to a certain extent. I think you need to explore those relationships with intergovernmental organizations that exist and to see what, leverage, value add can be gained there. But you should also be aware that, those intergovernmental organizations have their own rules and procedures, governing boards, etc., governing bodies, and they will have their own ways of seeking to interact with the treaty going forward, and that's something to bear in mind as well. But I certainly would say that there is absolutely, value to be gained from doing what Tamara has just said, which is starting to have a dialogue and a discussion now about what those requirements are going to be going forward and how you're going to meet those requirements. I think that would be a really valuable place to start.
Thank you, Chris. And we've just had another question come in, which if I might actually address this to Tamara first to provide a sort of external perspective in this. But question relates to the potential role for UNODA or broader UN processes in sort of trying to address some of the division and the difficulties. As what can civil society do? What could international organisations do in terms of trying to push forward and trying to really kind of seize the moment in terms of developing an international organisation, institutional support for the TPNW. So is there things you think which the UN could or should be doing to address this beyond those Chris has laid out?
I sort of hate to answer this question in Chris's stead here, as I think he's much closer to the work of UNODA and is probably better equipped to answer what they imagine for their specific contribution. Did you want to answer first, Chris?
Please go ahead, Tamara.
I honestly would have to think about it. I think, I think it's worth thinking about this process in terms of what the priorities and what the objectives are. as a first pass, rather than, you know, immediately assigning these tasks to different organizations and places in the UN. I think it's worth sort of, for instance, drafting what a year or 2 years in the life of the TPNW might look like in terms of discussions and other processes that might extend beyond the scope of the MSP in terms of issues that would help to be addressed and thought about in more detail in order to support the work of the MSP. And I think that with this model that is based on issues of implementation and issues of substance, states can then work backward and perform this, this more detailed sort of cost-benefit analysis that we've been discussing for various formulations of how the UNODA would contribute, how the ISU or Secretariat would contribute, and what different options in terms of scientific and technical engagement or advice might look like. So that doesn't answer your question, but I hope that helps lay out the pieces at least.
Thank you, Tamara. I mean, it seems to be a treaty between both strong views on both sides, which often requires some navigation, but I'd be interested if I could put the question to you, Chris, on the role of UNODA, the role of civil society bodies, of academia. Is there a potential space for trying to facilitate dialogue around this treaty, or to try and bridge some of the differences and understandings, or do you think there's a role there?
Yeah, I do. I mean, certainly one of the things that if you listen to what the Secretary General has said recently about, you know, a new multilateralism and involving other stakeholders, I think that listening to expert points of view from both sides of the aisle is a really, really good idea, and to have a dialogue over this and you know, between civil society actors, academia, technical bodies. I think there's no loss to be had from that at all. And I think that it's up to, you know, individual organizations and individuals themselves whether they want to participate in that kind of dialogue. And if UNODA is, you know, as currently acting as, you know, the support unit to the TPNW is instructed to hold that kind of dialogue, we would be more than happy to do so. And certainly if you listen to what the High Representative has been saying about trying to find a modus vivendi between those people who have strong opinions about the treaty from one side or the other, that is something that we'll be looking to get to as well. If you look at the role of ODA going forward, you know, the treaty does talk about the Secretary General and the Secretary General's role in facilitating meetings of states parties. And there is a General Assembly resolution tasking us to provide all support. So, I mean, for the moment, that's what we take as our guide about how we will, you know, act within the treaty going forward. But you know, that obviously is subject to change moving forward.
Thanks, Chris. And we've also had a couple of comments on the question. If I can read out one of the comments in the Q&A session, which indicates that as far as the verification and compliance are concerned, it is essential to fully capitalise on existing institutions. Therefore, given the relatively small number of states parties, it might be important to maintain a rather small ISU that mainly functions as a focal point for liaising with these other institutions on issues of verification and compliance, while being primarily responsible for reporting and the convening of MSPs. I think that's similar to a point that you made tomorrow in terms of the early stages of the organisation before it could expand in due course. We also have a question which I'll put to both of you, and this is sort of linked with one of the questions I find it useful to put to people towards the end of these events, and that relates to the first meeting of states parties. And will this be a sort of crucial juncture in addressing some of these institutional issues, or at least setting the agenda moving forward? And what can be done in advance of that in order to sort of pave the way? Does anybody want to take that question at all? Chris, please.
Look, I mean, just to say, I don't know. I mean, if you want to go into what the meeting of states parties is supposed to do more broadly, but obviously, you know, that MSP1 has several tasks under the treaty that it's supposed to do, specifically under Article 4. You know, determining a deadline for the removal of nuclear weapons. You know, designating a competent international authority. I mean, these are, and even though it's actually not specifically tasked for MSP1, there is also the legally binding time-bound plan for verified and irreversible elimination, that could also be considered at the time of what that might look like and what shape that might take. So the MSP1 has a lot on its plate, but I would have thought that certainly these institutional arrangements are something that states parties would want to consider. And certainly, if not at the meeting itself, then we have, give or take, 12 months, in which the meeting can be held. I think it would be really useful to have a preparatory process that deals with a lot of these issues in the lead up to the meeting of states parties. I think that would be a very useful thing for states to engage in with civil society and other experts.
Thanks, Chris. That's really useful. Tamara, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, just to build on what Chris said, I think what we've seen in terms of setting up the institutional support structures for previous treaties in this space, it's relatively common for things like ISUs to take some time to be set up after a treaty enters into force. But I think that, given the level of controversy surrounding the TPNW, I certainly agree that it's something, as Chris said, that we need we have the opportunity to get right, and it's a process that shouldn't be rushed in terms of learning from the ways other treaties have approached this in the past. But I will say again that I think, given the level of controversy surrounding this treaty, the sooner states parties and civil society can get to work in demonstrating the treaty's value and contribution, I think the easier it will be to leverage some of this positive momentum and energy that this treaty has brought into the area of nuclear disarmament. So again, I think, as Chris mentioned, laying out in detail some of these different models in advance of the MSP, and thinking about possibly making proposals and taking decisions at the first MSP is worth considering.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you both for taking on that question. There's another question which has emerged in the Q&A function, and I'll probably make this the last one because I also want to ask you to give us a sort of recap on your key take-home points or steps to consider. But before I move to that, I wanted to follow up on a question in the Q&A, which is whether either of you have thought about the similarities between TPNW and nuclear weapon-free zones institutional machinery. So examples being things like OpenRL. Could these sort of models, or could there be other models such as the Sustainable Development Goals? Could they serve as ideas that could be followed up on institutionally? There are examples here we could look at. Either of you have any thoughts on that particular question? If not,
I would just add, sorry, Jamie, that I think there's an opportunity to be treaty magpies here, and really just to sort of pick and choose the good things, the things that work, the things that add value. So yes, I think looking at a model like OpenRL or AFCON or any of those nuclear weapons free zones models would be a useful thing to do.
Thanks, Chris. Tamara, did you want to respond to that? Please go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's certainly a lot that we can learn from nuclear weapon-free zones and the way these treaties and arrangements are structured. At the same time, I think they also highlight interesting areas of work for what they don't necessarily address in terms of issues that I mentioned that will be discussed in the next panel related to how you define or conceptualize or set standards around a nuclear weapon program or a nuclear weapon. We really don't have any way to sort of determine, what irreversible elimination and things like that mean. And nuclear weapon-free zone treaties have not addressed that as a part of their work, and it's something that could be taken up in the context of the TPNW to sort of move toward a clearer set of standards for disarmament in these areas.
Great, thank you, Tamara. That also sets us up quite nicely for next week's discussion with my colleague Pavel Podvig will moderate. I'm going to wrap up shortly, but before I do, Just want to check whether any of the panelists would like to identify one or two key take-home points or steps which they think it is crucial, and these can be things which have already been discussed and already raised, but the things you both think are most important moving forward in terms of institutional support. Is there anything you'd like to really remind the audience of moving forward? Perhaps Chris, do you want to take the lead on this, drawing on some of your earlier points as well?
Yeah, I mean, Jamie, the one thing that I would really, and I hate to be the penny pinching bureaucrat, but costs, practicalities, all that sort of stuff really needs to be taken into account in the lead up to MSP1, and in any sort of, looking into any sort of support unit, no matter what it looks like, it's going to cost money and it's going to need to be sustainable. So the sustainability, and then roles and responsibilities really to be strategic in terms of thinking about what they look like going forward. I think those from an international civil servant perspective, those are the two things that I would strongly recommend states parties look into.
Thank you, Chris. And Tamara, please.
Yeah. And yeah, I certainly sympathize with the practical and cost considerations that Chris is discussing, and I think a careful consideration is certainly warranted. And I think I would just reiterate the value of looking at some of these immediate institutional questions of implementation with both sustainability in mind, as Chris mentioned, as well as the long-term goals of the treaty in mind. Because I think, as we discussed in the paper, many of these questions about supporting structures that we're talking about in the near term have a great deal of bearing on what would happen if the treaty's universalization efforts begin to succeed, as we hope they will, and you have one or more current or former nuclear weapon states seeking to join. So completely agree that we need to be practical, and I hope that we can sort of have that process guided by the long-term picture as well as the immediate one.
Great, thank you very much, Tamara. And indeed, thank you very much to both of you for taking the time to join for this event. I won't take any more questions, so I'll briefly wrap up. But yeah, just to say thank you again. I think it's been really useful. If I could also express my thanks to the UNIDIR team, in particular Letitia Zarkan, our UNIDIR producer. And also thank you to the audience for joining this event. You should receive an email requesting feedback, advice, and suggestions for helping us to improve our events moving forward. Please do fill that in. It can be extremely useful for us so we can get a sense of what we should do more of or what we should do less of. And just as a sort of concluding reminder, this is the second in a series of 4 events that we're organising on the implementation of the TPNW. The next event will take place on Monday at 3 p.m. And this one will look at compliance, enforcement and verification issues. So we hope to see you back here for that in a week's time. So thank you all for taking the time to join us, and good day, good night, depending on where this finds you. Okay, I wish you all the best. Thank you.